There is an absolute understanding and growing consensus that there is a lot of harmful content online, and we can't get rid of it all. How can we identify those people in that harmful space who are actually most at risk of doing something offline? And it's a huge challenge, but if we can go some way or contribute towards that, then that would be very satisfying for me.
Welcome to the Research for Good podcast. I'm David Ellis, and today I'm going to be talking to Dr Olivia Brown. It's really nice to have you on the podcast, Liv.
Thanks, David. Yeah, it's really nice to be here.
Liv, you're a lecturer at the University of Bath in Organisation and Behaviour. To start off, can you tell us a bit about how did you get here?
So I did a psychology undergraduate degree. I guess like many people doing psychology undergraduates with the view to potentially doing clinical psychology afterwards. But it got to third year and we sort of started to have more optional modules. And I remember doing one on terrorism and conflict. And it just absolutely blew my mind that as a psychologist we could be working in that type of space, or that there was kind of value or potential to be a psychologist doing research in that space. So it was kind of that module that sort of changed my career trajectory, if you will. Decided to do a master's, and then I guess through that I was kind of umming and ahhing whether to go for kind of more industry focused, maybe security research type jobs, or whether to kind of carry on and do a PhD. Midway through the master's there was some CREST PhDs that I noticed, so CREST being the Centre for Research and Evidence on Security Threats. And I guess reading about the centre, it just really got me kind of excited. So that was sort of what pushed me over the edge into making that decision to do a PhD. Initially, I was tasked to look at kind of goals and how emergency response agencies manage different goals across teams. So if you imagine police might have different goals to ambulance. When I sort of looked into the area a bit more, I kind of wanted to make it a little bit broader. So I actually looked at teamwork in extreme environments, I guess, as a more kind of broader category. So some of my work was with expedition teams, and some of the research was with emergency response teams. And I suppose looking at that area and looking at this kind of extreme high pressure, high stakes environment, there is so much theoretical research that comments on this as, you know, this is really high stress, this is really high stakes, this will affect how people can work together. But that empirical research is really lacking, and that kind of working with end users and figuring out what's actually going on is really lacking. So a lot of the PhD was kind of, how can we take all this theoretical work and how can we actually see how some of these sort of models might work in practice?
When you were doing that research, were you going into the wild to do this?
Yeah, so I was really lucky to do a brilliant study with the emergency services. So we were at one of their simulated training events. So this was with kind of senior commanders from across military, police, fire, ambulance, local governments. And we recorded their training exercise. So they were responding to a terrorist attack, and we recorded their entire kind of interactions. So this was more like kind of strategic level decision making. So not people on the ground, people at the top kind of making those decisions. And that was absolutely fascinating. And it's like, if you really want to understand how people are making decisions, then you want to go and talk and witness how they're making decisions in, I guess, not situ because it's simulation, but as close to reality as you can get. It was really interesting and great timing in the sense that, I mean, terrible timing in the sense that obviously the Manchester Arena terrorist attack was an awful event. But we were doing this research around that time. So it was, and when we look at the Manchester Arena attack, a lot of the outcomes were around this difficulty between cross-agency working. So we've probably all seen the headlines around the fire service not turning up to the scene until a bit later. There was also a lot of headlines around kind of the pressure placed on the police commander to make decisions on the night. And this was very much what we were looking at. We were looking at kind of how do people communicate across agencies and how do they coordinate decisions as a group. And very similar to the reports of the Arena attack, we found that there is a lot of emphasis placed on one person, one agency, the police, and that communications end up being funneled through that one person. So they not only have to manage all the communications, but they also have to try and make all the big decisions. But when we look at kind of the emergency management frameworks, it's supposed to be joint decisions, distributed communications.
In terms of success then, is it presumably better when they have those more distributed decisions?
Yeah, so that was kind of what we were reporting in our paper, was that if we want to help with that kind of cognitive load on that one person, we need to think about how can we decentralize the communication structures. So, for example, with the Manchester Arena attack, there was that comment around, well, how could the police commander be on the phone to the fire service telling them where they should go when they're also on scene trying to direct people in the moment to respond to the incident. And one person does not have the capacity to do that. So if we have more decentralized structures, that communication is getting passed along and moved along, and someone's able to then focus on that decision-making process. And I think one of the real challenges is kind of, it's all good to say this in practice, but obviously it's really hard, even with simulations, to emulate that kind of severe pressure that we see in those moments. And I mean, the police commander made some excellent decisions, some very dynamic, some very good decisions, and they were very much praised in that report. But the key thing that kept coming up time and time again was this communication challenge. And we see it across lots of different emergency incidents. When we reflect back, it's this idea of how can you maintain communication, that shared awareness aspect, that kind of being on the same page, when we're also trying to deal with kind of decisions that will affect the moment.
The million-dollar question: have those findings fed back into the way in which the emergency services are being trained?
Yeah, so that is something that we are kind of trying to work on. So I know some colleagues of mine have recently got some funding to look specifically at training. So we reported back the findings at numerous different events, lots of workshops, lots of conversations with both the police but also the broader emergency services. And I think what's really exciting is that it echoes exactly with what they are thinking and what they are trying to do. So yeah, that's definitely something that I want to kind of work more towards in the future, is like what kind of specific training sort of regimes and practices will actually lead to behavioural changes.
After your PhD, you moved to the University of Bath to take up a postdoctoral position that was also funded by CREST. Can you tell me a bit about that?
The motivation for me working in academia was always wanting to work in a kind of broader counter-terrorism space. Now, of course, the emergency services work is about counter-terrorism in terms of in the moment, how do you respond to terrorism? But my main passion has always been around kind of, not necessarily radicalisation stages, but more thinking about kind of extremism as a problem and extremism as a challenge, and thinking about how we can kind of research, understand and respond to that. So when the postdoc position came up at Bath, which was sort of touching on right-wing extremism online and trying to understand kind of how we can link online behaviour to offline behaviour, I was just really, really excited, and it felt like a really natural next step.
It sounds like you place a lot of value on real-world data, if that's the right way to frame it. That's obviously been a conscious decision. Yeah,
absolutely. I think I've always felt this. I think since sort of undergraduate, when you hear various lectures, I was more inspired by the lecturers who are working in those kind of real world contexts. And for me, research has always been about, yes, we want that academic rigor. We want to advance our careers with good publications and that kind of rigorous research. But if that research can't be used, then it's not what's the point, because research for research's sake is really important. But I am personally more motivated by those real world outcomes. So how can somebody use what I've done? And how can I see that impact on kind of real tangible things in the real world?
The government has recently just published the Online Harms Bill, a draft version, and it speaks about trying to make the UK the safest place online to be. A lot of your work touches on that. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
We've seen in recent years the increase in extremist content online. So people are now encountering some kind of extreme or hateful or potentially harmful content. While users under 30, about 40% of them are saying they're encountering it on a regular basis. So we know that kind of extremist content has increased. We also know, specifically in my area, that the threat of right-wing terrorism is increasing. So we've seen a lot of, I know that jihadi-inspired attacks do still dominate, but we are seeing more and more right-wing attacks. So what we've got is this really interesting kind of intersection of the fact that kind of the extremist content's increasing, the right-wing threat is increasing. We know that right-wing terrorism is very much linked to the online space. They use it to communicate, to interact, to recruit, to plan attacks. How do we disentangle those who are a genuine threat versus those who are just posting this extremist content without any intention of ever doing anything violent or any intention of ever leaving their bedroom almost with this content. And that was kind of the motivation behind much of the project that I'm working on at the moment, is how do we identify those needles in a haystack? If we're looking for the most angry, the most hateful person, that doesn't necessarily mean that that person's going to get up tomorrow and leave the house and go and do something violent. We know that it's not as simple as that. So it's what can we learn from these online communications that can actually help us understand how to begin detecting reliable risk signals. So that's very much the motivation behind the project that I'm working on at the moment.
You said it yourself, it's a needle in a haystack. How do you go about doing that when you've got lots of people online, but then only so many attacks in a year that are potentially right-wing driven? How do you go about even getting near what the risks are?
Lots of studies look at entire platforms of posting behaviours. So they might look at several million posts and try and understand kind of trajectories in posting, or how can we build algorithms to detect hateful or extremist language. Now, as I've kind of already touched upon, this idea that the person who's posting the most hateful content is the most at risk, we know that that doesn't always hold true. So just building algorithms to detect hateful language isn't going to really be able to take us on that next step to actually saying, oh, this person's more at risk of committing a violent offence versus this person. So that was the key thing that I saw that was problematic with the area, was that we can't just analyse millions of posts and try and detect hate. We need to be able to start comparing against people who have been convicted of an attack versus people that are angry online, very extreme, but have never actually gone and done anything. So that was the main aim of this project. So I set about on a year-long effort, very much sort of putting my investigative journalist hat on, to try and identify data that belonged to convicted right-wing terrorists. So this involved court reports, news reports, lots and lots of searching to try and get some online data from people who had actually been convicted of an attack. Eventually got there, ended up with about 27, 28 people that we could tie to a portion of digital data. And then we wanted to compare this data to people who are very much extreme but had never been convicted. So we had a comparison sample of about 55 people. So the aim was, we've got about 200,000 posts. Can we look for differences in our convicted and our non-convicted extremists?
And do you look at all those posts?
So, that has been a real challenge working in this space. So I actually qualitatively looked at 30,000 of the 200,000 posts. So going through post by post and looking for what kind of content was included in the post. Now, 30,000 posts is a lot to analyse on any sample, but going through line by line, and obviously there's a lot of racism, homophobia, truly awful language, and I think you do have to build up resilience to that. I'm lucky to know a few other researchers in the right-wing space who we can kind of touch base with and reflect on. But yeah, it's really hard and it's really horrible content, but it definitely kind of comes back to, well, what's motivating you? And for me, this is so important. When you see how much of this content is out there and you see the potential threat and risk, somebody has to look at this, somebody has to be doing research in this space. So it's horrible, but it's necessary, I think.
It sounds a little bit like not a million miles away from what social media companies claim they're doing to try and clean up the internet, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you only realise when you start looking at it in detail the pure kind of vastness of this. And I think you can see the challenges with trying to clean up this content, because some of it might not come up in those sort of classic algorithms of hate speech, because they're getting very clever now at talking about kind of very racist and very horrible topics. So it might not use language that you might typically associate with hate, but actually what they're saying is incredibly offensive and incredibly, awful and obviously completely unacceptable. But it might not contain those buzzwords that maybe social media algorithms are looking for.
It sounds like there's a bit of a cat and mouse there between trying to keep ahead of the bad guys.
The right-wing space, or the online space in general, is evolving all the time. The right-wing kind of extremist space in particular is very interesting because they've always been ahead of the curve with the internet. So like in the 90s, they were using dating message boards to spread racist messages. They then sort of moved on to specific platforms and forums much before many people in society did. So they've always been very good at using the internet. So we're kind of chasing...
It's not just chasing what they're saying, it's also where they're putting that information as well.
Yeah.
So it's a technological race as well as a research question, race.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So I mean, I'm lucky with our data in terms of it was really very much at a time where users were using the internet, but we've seen so many arrests in recent years linked to online posts that there is a concern now that users will switch to offline again, or even darker websites. So we're always trying to think about kind of how can we make what we do useful even if the landscape shifts, because the landscape will shift, and it has done, over the last 10 years.
Why do you have to then read all the messages if it can all be automated?
Yeah, so I think I feel very passionate about this in terms of my understanding now, I guess kind of dark in a sense, of like the right-wing online space is absolutely vast, because I understand the nuances and the kind of the contextual specifics of that extremist group. So there might be some words that are used regularly that without that qualitative analysis, you might throw them out of the machine learning model because you're like, well, that has to just be noise. We'll take that predictor out because it clearly isn't relevant. But if you have that qualitative understanding, so you've gone through post by post, you generate that understanding and knowledge of what is important. And actually there are some things in our machine learning model that if someone looked at it blind, they'd be like, why on earth is that in there? So I think you need that. I don't want to take our findings to government or law enforcement and say, run this algorithm and it might help you identify who's at risk. I want to be able to sit down with them and explain exactly why I think that algorithm works based on my knowledge and understanding of what these forums look like.
In terms of the work you do looking at content online, or extremist right-wing content online, what's the end impact of that work?
So government agencies are battling with this challenge of how do we decide who to monitor. There obviously are finite resources. We can't monitor everyone. Not everyone poses a genuine security threat. So how do we decide where to direct those resources towards? So in our work, we're trying to work collaboratively with government agencies to try and inform these prioritization strategies, to try and help monitor those people who need monitoring, essentially. So I always like to say that rather than finding a needle in a haystack, it's about reducing the size of the haystack. So reducing the amount of people that need monitoring, who are potentially going to pose a threat to public safety.
And at the other end, from an ethical perspective, it's also about making sure we're not monitoring people we don't need to monitor.
Absolutely. So there's definitely a kind of a two sides to that story around kind of, I obviously disagree with their right-wing extremist and often horrendous views, but that doesn't mean that we should be monitoring every single word that person says if they aren't demonstrating any risk to public safety or any sort of risk or potential of harm. So how do we know who the people are that genuinely require that close level of monitoring?
And that speaks to those bigger societal challenges as well, doesn't it? About how do we police the internet? That's what the UK government are trying to navigate.
And I think there's that understanding that there'll never be a reduction of in absolute harm of online spaces. The online space is too big. It's evolving all the time. It's growing all the time. But if we can just get a little bit more of an understanding of what content is potentially most harmful or who is most likely to be harmed by that content, then we can start developing better interventions, better strategies. I think that something that comes up time and time again, it doesn't matter who you're talking to in whatever government agency, from the police to the Home Office or whoever it is, there is always this challenge around how do we identify risk online? Because like you say, around this kind of government harms initiative, there is an absolute understanding and growing consensus that there is a lot of harmful content online and we can't get rid of it all. How can we identify those people in that harmful space who are actually most at risk of doing something offline? And it's a huge challenge, but if we can go some way or contribute towards that, then that would be very satisfying for me.
Is the threat of far-right extremism growing?
So interestingly, the actual arrests seem to have levelled off a little bit this year. I'm not sure if that's pandemic related or it could just be that fever pitch has somewhat levelled out. But what's really worrying is that the referrals to the PREVENT programme, which is the government's kind of anti-extremism, trying to intervene at terrorism at the early stage programme, is increasing all the time for far-right referrals and really sort of worryingly for under 16s as well. So one of the things with the far right, this link with the internet, is that we're seeing younger and younger people getting involved with these groups via platforms like Instagram, Telegram, and that does not seem to be slowing down. So in terms of that threat growing, if we're having more and more young people getting engaged in this space, then of course some of them will drop out, but you have to worry about where that will look in 5 years' time when these individuals maybe get more capability or get more invested in the movements.
Without getting too political, why do you think there is this rise in these referrals to prevent that are coming from the right wing?
The right wing space has been absolutely bolstered by the pandemic. So there are lots of government reports at the moment around kind of how the far right is exploiting the pandemic. So this uncertainty, this anti-government, anti-authority sentiment has only kind of bolstered their groups, and they are now expanding beyond these niche far right groups to these larger kind of anti-government groups, and we won't know what the impact of that is for a long time to come. I know that the police did a report on the fact that teenagers spending so much time in their bedrooms, if they come across these pages on Instagram, then they're more likely to potentially go down that rabbit hole because they are, stuck at home without anything to do. But I think as we see the wider political climate polarised on both sides, the problem is that if it goes one way, then it'll pull the other way. And I always see it's amazing that we're having almost a moment of reckoning in terms of understanding and pushing for kind of better practices and policies around diversity and moving more towards that. But unfortunately, when that happens, on the flip side of that, those that are opposed to that or indifferent to that are more likely to get pushed the other way. And I think that's what we are witnessing, unfortunately, on a large scale.
I wondered if that also feeds into things like growing levels of inequality, cost of living crisis, economic stagnation.
Absolutely, and it could. I think we see, particularly, I suppose, around the kind of the COVID-19 anti-vax and far right overlaps. A lot of that was around kind of anti-government sentiment, and of course, the fallout of that now, as we see the cost of living rise. Why did we spend all that money on vaccines that we didn't need, and now we have no money for X, Y, and Z? So this frustration around kind of what authority represents and kind of where people sit within society is bubbling, and it is growing. And unfortunately, when we see people in times of uncertainty and times of challenge, they are more drawn towards those kind of more polarized and extremist viewpoints. So I think that I'm very interested in kind of the absolute kind of far end of the far right in terms of potential terrorism, but I'm also fascinated and equal parts fascinated and horrified about this kind of coalescing of potential far right with potential anti-government, with potential COVID concerns, and how that will shape potentially in the next 5 years.
You've done a huge amount of work in quite a comparatively short space of time in this area. What's next?
Yeah, so I think for me, definitely this kind of not just specific to the COVID context, but how ideologies can coalesce based on a wider contextual factor. So we've had the pandemic and we see this kind of coming together of far right and anti-vaccine beliefs. How that happens and where that goes is something that I'm really, really interested in. So I obviously, as someone who monitors many different far right forums, seeing the rise in numbers, seeing how the far right have manipulated and exploited the pandemic is of real concern to me. And what I would love to do is kind of look at, over time, what is the impact of that? So are we going to see a huge drop-off, or are we going to see kind of potential rising threats across time? I mean, what I found really fascinating was that when the Ukrainian-Russian war broke out, many of the people in those groups then pivoted towards, well, the government's lying about Ukraine, we should feel a bit sorry for Russia. So it almost seems that it'll flip from one issue to another. And I'd be really interested in kind of looking into this space, these coalescing of ideologies, and working out what potential long-term impacts might be.
Does all this research make you more cynical or forget that there's still good in people? Like, if you're looking at a lot of that content, how do you, well, first of all, how do you walk away from it and forget about it for some time? But also, how do you then remind yourself that there are good people?
Yeah, I'm definitely more cynical. I think I've noticed that whether it's reading a news report or looking at someone on social media, I always sort of start thinking, not the worst, but I'll always think, is there an angle on that, or kind of what could be behind that? And I think it does definitely make you more skeptical of various things within the world. I mean, I think a big example for me was that much of the outcomes of the Black Lives Matter marches were really positive, and it was fantastic to see awareness being raised. My main thought was, oh gosh, if this is all in the news, then what are the far right going to think of this? And what if they start doing counter protests, which they did just 2 weeks later? So I think it's like you're almost then expecting bad behaviour when good things happen, because of that understanding that, well, if something on that side of things is being promoted, then they might want to promote on the other side of things. So that can be quite hard, of that kind of expectancy of, rather than just enjoying something quite positive, you're already pre-thinking about a negative. But I think the way in which I kind of stay, I guess, okay and mentally well around all of this is just reminding myself of the importance of doing the research in this space. And when you kind of see positive things happening, you really have to kind of hold on to that and be excited and be happy about that, and be grateful that you're able to make a somewhat of an impact in that space. Because once you've opened Pandora's box and you know what's in there, you're not going to forget what's in there. So for me, it's kind of, well, at least I can try and work towards helping and preventing it, rather than just being on the outside of it.
It sounds like you're very much driven by trying to make a difference.
Yes, definitely. That is absolutely kind of what motivates me as a researcher.
Thanks very much, Liv, for your time today. It's been a real eye-opener. It's also remarkable that you can, in an interesting way, end it on a sort of positive note by, despite the challenges, despite the seriousness of it, there is still a positive that can come out of a lot of this research.
No, absolutely, and it's been a real pleasure to talk with you today. It's been really enjoyable. So thanks very much for having me.
You've been listening to the Research4Good podcast. If you want to learn more about Olivia's work, as well as other School of Management research that focuses on making the world a better place, then visit the Research4Good page on the University of Bath website. You can find the link in the episode description.